The film you have just watched is a true story. In July 2004, 17-year-old Terry Hurst was murdered on a camping trip by 3 former friends. Using a garden scythe stolen from Boulderstone Church, 2 17-year-old boys and a 16-year-old girl left Terry dead, with over 60 injuries and the weapon embedded in his head in Broomhead Reservoir, Yorkshire. His body was found by a farmer with a plastic skull pulled over his head and a 5-foot agricultural scythe embedded in his skull. But Cruel Summer doesn't feel like a horror movie based on the tragic murder of a vulnerable person. Horrors like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Girl Next Door, Deranged, Borderland, and Eaten Alive feel like makers heard the real story and thought it would make a great horror film. Cruel Summer, on the other hand, feels like a movie made about the tragic murder of a vulnerable person, and its subject matter, almost without consideration, shaped and necessitated the film falling into the horror genre. It's a fascinating study of an about-face in terms of how a story drives a horror. The story wasn't exploited to be a horror film. The story was told, and it turned out to be a horror film. The film is very heavily based on the murder of Terry. Details like the names and location have been changed in an attempt to show this problem is recurring, and not just a one-off. But it is, without doubt, a retelling of that real-life killing. The victim is still autistic, the murderers are still 2 boys and a girl, and the body is still found with a plastic bag over its head and a scythe in its skull. This is important because it skillfully manages to achieve both the things it's aiming for, a depiction of the murder of Terry and of a societal problem. By telling a specific story, but blurring the edges into fiction, the impact becomes greater than the sum of its parts by putting a knowable face on an encompassing message. In Escott's interview with Decay Mag, he says that he wanted to bring attention to the topic of autism, to show the spectrum of the condition being vast and varied, and to show a character with more to him than just his autism. This is as much a drama as a horror, and it makes it all the more disturbing because it's aided by a staggeringly good portrayal of Danny, this film's Terry, by Richard Pawlowski. The concentration was on creating a credible and authentic autistic teenager, not on creating a sympathetic victim to enhance the horror. Ironically, by focusing on a portrayal of an autistic teenager, it hits the target of creating that sympathetic victim to enhance the horror far more accurately than a focus on shooting for that as a priority target ever could.
Watching it in the editing suite, that's when it became difficult, because then you have the story as a whole in front of you and you realise what is happening. When you're filming it, you just have that scene, that fragment. It's not cohesive, it doesn't all tie in together. So when you're there in the editing suite and you realise the power of what you have, that's when it starts to strike a chord. And that's when you need to start to become rational and realise the power of the images. So that's when you start reining back on the levels of violence that you show. Because, yeah, the film could have been a lot more violent than the finished product, but it wasn't because it didn't need to be. I mean, in some instances, less truly is more, and I think this is a very good case of that. The initial idea behind the film was to explore random violence and how that occurred, and as a result of that and our research into random violence, that's where we started learning about these stories, and it all morphed and became from our research into random violence. So the initial plan was to create a film where someone wakes up in the morning, ends up dead at the end of the day. And on the flip side, the other alternative is someone wakes up in the morning, goes to bed a murderer, and trying to find a way of interjecting those stories. So I guess the Terry Hurst sort of case was a good avenue for that, because the poor guy was out camping, but in the true life case, I mean, it was all premeditated. It was a cold-hearted murder. They went with him purposely. They all went camping together. So if we were to take that one story and make a film about that, it'd be unfilmable. It's just a diabolical, heinous crime that there'd be nothing in that would be of merit or even redeeming. So that was never an option, really. We didn't think of making that one murder into a feature film. It had to be its own entity, and that's why the research into other random acts of violence came in handy, especially when it comes to the bullying and the peer pressure.
Reprehensible crimes have long played a part in influencing cinema. The two genres to profit most from others' misfortunes are, without a doubt, gangster and horror. Gangster movies, for the most part, are not vilified for depicting and indeed glamorizing the lifestyle of its subjects, who are little more than very organized serial killers in suits. Those are the films that are praised, the ones who win awards from the mainstream institutions. 1990's Goodfellas springs to mind, which won Best Picture at that year's BAFTAs, Oscars and Golden Globes. Going back further to 1967's Bonnie and Clyde, this tale of the notorious real-life murderers was met with a raft of Oscar noms, even while containing boundary-pushing and glorified violence. Like many true crime gangster films, it sets out to thrill its audiences with tales of real-life murder. When it comes to real killers' exploits in horror, however, well, that's a different matter. Gangster movies tend to tell sweeping operas set over the course of many years, their crimes carried out within a well-oiled organization and for practicality, not passion. The murders are well thought out, planned, executed, and hidden. They're so clean they actually employ people called cleaners to dispose of any mess. True crime horror, however, mostly tells smaller, more intimate stories. The crimes here are ones of emotion or obsession. They're personal. The acts are committed on and by people we could know. We can immediately relate to them, much more than we ever could a member of La Cosa Nostra. These crimes are not efficient, they are not clean, and they certainly aren't pretty. Perhaps that's why true crime horror films are seen by the conservative as in bad taste and low class. They're not safe. True crime gangster films take place in some dingy corner of New York. True crime horror films take place next door. They show people the world they wish they could pretend isn't there. They remind you of the violence that hides in plain sight. Writer-director Philip Escott's film Cruel Summer is a movie that specializes in reminding us of the violence that hides in plain sight. Even the greatest horror aficionados would agree that real life is often far more frightening than any one film. Cinema may allow us to utterly escape into fantastical worlds far beyond our own, but in this case, it can also hold a mirror to the dark, unsavory corners of societal behavior that are often ignored, but still very much alive.
In the valley there were shadows and death. Got out of life but with scars I can't forget. This kid back in school, something to shine. An orphan and a brother, and a scene by both nights. I don't know what it was, I made a piece of him die. Took a bite to the forest, swallowed it with his eye. Stabbed on his face, an impression in the dirt. To your face a silent, makes a good man come first.